audience are probably aware, you're also the author of A Concise History of Israel, a fabulous book. And I'd like you to then, with someone with that sort of perspective, to zoom out. And I want you to think about the Jewish people in a historical comparative context and tell us, how are we doing?
Well, I heard people laugh, how are we doing? I know my kids aren't here, but if they were in the room, they would be laughing hilariously also, because they would say, oh my God, you're asking him how we're doing. Just get ready now for this long story about how things have just gotten terrible and it's a horrible world and etc. But the reality, of course, is that my kids are always wrong when they make fun of me. And more importantly, we're doing great. And I think it's really very important for us to remember that. Ask yourself across history, go back 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years, but certainly 2,000 years really since the beginning of the long exile of the Jews. When have the Jews ever been in better shape than we are now? We have a tremendous number of challenges facing us, but we are also an extraordinary experiment in rebuilding after coming very close to the precipice. Imagine for a moment that we were now in January 1946. Okay, a year after the liberation of Auschwitz, still several years away from the creation of the State of Israel, and you are a person who is sane, knowledgeable, aware of what's going on in the world, and somebody says to you, tell me something about the future of the Jewish people. In January 1946, the only sane thing that you could say is that the greatest days of the Jewish people had to have been in the past. There was no other way to look at the world. I mean, think about it. Eastern European Jewry was gone. Those who were still alive were, for the most part, living behind the Iron Curtain in a situation that was going to get infinitely worse before it started to get better. The United States had closed its borders, as had Canada, which prevented millions of Jews from escaping and having somewhere to go. And I remind you that there was one protest during the Holocaust, one protest of 400 rabbis who went to Washington, and the president refused to meet with them, in fact. But there were highways, and there was newspaper, and there was television, and there was radio, and there were airplanes, and there was one protest during all of those years. So if you look at Eastern Europe, it was a disaster. If you look at the middle of Europe and Western Europe, it was in shambles. The United States had nothing to be proud of back then in terms of what it had done for the Jews. And if you turned your attention over to the Middle East, there was a place called Palestine where 100,000 British soldiers were patrolling mostly the shores, making sure that people who were trying to flee a burning Europe a few years earlier couldn't get in. Now, if you looked at that world, you would have had to have said, the greatest days of the Jewish people are behind us. But in fact, quite the opposite is true. These are, in fact, probably the greatest days of the Jewish people in 2,000 years. They're the greatest days because we have a State of Israel. Zionism was meant to do a couple of things. It was meant to create an environment in which Jews would not have to live at the behest of anyone else's goodwill. They would live in a place where they didn't have to worry day in and day out. When was that invitation to Spain, Portugal, Germany, the United States, wherever, going to run out? Israelis don't worry about that. Zionism was actually meant to provide a model of Jewish life in which assimilation would not be a paramount issue. And ask Israelis, Shmuel Rosner just did this in a poll, ask Israelis what percentage of them are worried whether or not their grandchildren are going to be Jewish. The percentage who answer that they are worried approaches actually zero. And Zionism was meant to restore the Jewish people to a kind of a real whole with literature and music and theater and so on and so forth. And a country which in 1950s was running out of food and in the 1970s or 80s couldn't wait to hear who shot JR, is now exporting wine and is exporting television, exporting music, is exporting theater, is winning awards for literature all over the world, and it's put the Jewish people back into the center of the international economy of ideas and of culture. That means that what Zionism has done is that it's made the Jewish people a three-dimensional people once again, and that's what's enabled American Judaism to be the extraordinary success that it is. So the last sentence that I'll simply say is, of course, we face many challenges. We face many challenges, but we should be fundamentally aware that we face them from a position of great privilege and a position of great influence and strength. And our responsibility is to make sure that we